Hey everybody, we are Francis, Martin, and Robert, and this is Snakes and Otters, a pointless discussion of eternal questions. Get ready, we're about to live in your head rent-free. Welcome back to Snakes and Otters. This is episode 8. I am Francis in the captain's chair.
I'm Martin.
And I'm Robert.
And welcome back. We're going to be talking a little bit in extension of what we talked about last episode with Voltaire, but we're going to try to take it forward a little bit. And the premise I want to put together on this is I want us to discuss the American philosophical character. Where did it come from? How did we get to revere the things that we do revere, such as civil liberties, the Bill of Rights in particular? All those things that are enshrined in our legal history today are mostly unquestioned by us. They are simply, it's almost as if they came down like the Ten Commandments and were bestowed upon us, and see, here we are, and now we don't question that.
Most modern Western governments have enshrined those.
That's right.
Maybe not exactly the same way, but it's almost universal in the West.
Exactly. Obviously, there's something to them.
Mm-hmm.
But how did we get here? I submit that much of that was rooted in the Enlightenment, and Voltaire in particular, although many others. We've talked about Locke being extremely important in that, and there are many others. Let's talk a little bit about how the hell did we find ourselves here? Why in the world would Franklin and Jefferson and all those founding fathers think these were important? Was it reactionary, or was it truly enlightened?
Well, I would say, first of all, because there is a revolution, by default, there's going to be some reactionary,
of course, that's correct,
attitude and effect in there. You can make the argument that what the revolution was sparked by was not really justifiable in terms of, say, a just war theory for the break. But because even philosophically, really not that far
you had to gin up a lot of support for this.
You did.
This was not as grassroots or a groundswell of a movement as we, 200 years later, have revered it.
Right after it was over. Oh my God, we were always for the revolution.
That's right.
Well, you bring up a good point again. Having just finished Walter Isaacson's Benjamin Franklin, Franklin saw himself as a British citizen, as did the rest of the founders.
Mm-hmm.
And their gripe was, we're not being treated as such.
Yep.
Right.
Franklin, early on, is not one of the red-hot patriots. He is not Samuel Adams. He's not in that group initially.
No, get us out of here in whatever bloody way you can do it. That's
he's
okay.
very much a middle grounder for a long time, and to a degree, by some patriots, isn't trusted because of that.
Would you say he intends to make the world England, make America England?
Yes,
just on its own.
Basically, his thought,
which was British policy at this time, colonialism.
His gripe. Again, it seems odd to us because we see the British monarch as just, hey, it's just this family with all these divorces and crazy things going on. But he revered the king and wanted to remain the king's subject. His gripe was with Parliament. The American patriots thought they were getting screwed over initially, not by the king, but by Parliament. They just wanted they either wanted representation there, or they wanted their parliaments to have the same type of effect.
They wanted home rule.
Home rule, yeah. Essentially that's what they wanted.
I was going to say, but when did that change? Because there it comes along later. Franklin is very clearly quoted as, we don't want representation, we want independence. But this is later.
He comes to it later. He does come to it later. Again, after he has been in Europe. He has
been exposed to the philosophies of Locke, Voltaire, and all the others.
When he leaves Philadelphia and goes back to London and is trying to represent Pennsylvania, and isn't getting anywhere.
Right, he's ignored.
He gets humiliated, in fact.
Yes.
In what's called the cockpit, where they basically tell him, like you talked about before, why don't you go in the other room and kill some squirrels and leave government to the big boys here in London.
Yeah.
And that begins to harden him.
Right.
Well, and after a certain point, once the English land troops and begin trying to put down what they see as an insurrection.
Right.
Yes, that's a big part of it.
That's going to start changing things. And once enough blood has been spilled, there's no going back.
Yeah,
Which
they very much see that as you're using British troops against British citizens.
Yes.
You don't do that. I mean, that's like marching the Red Coast through London and shooting people.
Yeah,
to
it's
them.
like taking the shooting of the Kent State Four
Yeah.
and multiplying it across the entire country.
Yeah.
Think about that.
Absolutely.
National Guard firing on American citizens who are just on a college protesting. Now, I don't know all the details, how violent it really got, but, it was a cluster to begin with. Mm-hmm. And I imagine that a lot of what happened early on was very much a cluster the same way.
Right.
Yeah, there was, ham-fisted attempts. British politicians did not respect, the American settlers.
At their peril, ultimately.
Yeah, and it was very myopic. It really was. When you start to think about, being very forward-thinking, and why didn't a British politician look at New York and Philadelphia and go, look, we can't afford to lose these places. This is important stuff.
Because the idea of losing was inconceivable.
Yeah.
So
Right.
they didn't think about it. They didn't think that this was even possible.
This is a huge trade opportunity. These are awesome harbors.
I mean, there was an entire
shouldn't be-
continent of resources
That's correct.
that they basically gave away.
Right.
I mean,
Because they owned it, as far as they knew.
Right.
There were no indigenous people here to deal with, to speak of. We had enough here that it was ours at this point.
right.
In the 13 colonies, the indigenous people had been pushed out. So you've got basically a settled, safe production facility of lots of raw
A
materials.
captive market, too.
Exactly.
Captive market, yes.
And they abused it all the way around. And one of the great things about Franklin, and when you talk about someone who is forward thinking and forward looking, yes, even early on, he wanted to remain part of the empire and glorify the empire, but he also wanted the colonies to act in concert. He was one of the first ones to see that he's not just a Philadelphian, he's not just a Pennsylvanian. We have this opportunity to put these 13 independent places together and really accomplish something.
You would call that a proto-federalist?
I'm not sure Isaacson would go quite that far.
I think it's probably so far before its time, the appellation would be meaningless.
Yeah, but because he was a postmaster,
Yeah.
he was probably the most traveled person in the colonies.
No, that's a good point.
He was the one that could see
The need. And the potentiality.
Jefferson hardly ever left Virginia.
Right.
Until
he went to France.
Yeah.
And even then, that was different.
or go to Philadelphia for the conventions and stuff. Washington's probably somewhat more closer in travel. Again, as being a frontier soldier,
but not the same kind of travel.
That's right. Not in the north. No, he's still very southern.
Yeah.
Well, it's in the wilderness,
Absolutely.
But yeah, none of the rest of they were very much all part of their colony.
Right.
They saw themselves as a Virginian or a Carolinian
Well,
or
that philosophy
a New Yorker.
stayed until the Civil War.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's not the United States it was the United States are.
Yeah. And Franklin is the exception. He is the guy that sees that we can be more together than we are individually.
Yeah.
Which was radical at the time. And again, inconceivable. Most people don't think this way until they're forced to. By the time we get rid of the British, now what the hell are we going to do? What should this look like? Fortunately for all of us, Franklin had it pretty well figured out by that time.
No, that's a really awesome part of this book, and I don't want to drag us too far off from Voltaire, but when you get to the Constitutional Convention, Franklin is back from Europe. He did spend practically the entire revolution in Europe, in France,
mostly
caging for loans and help,
Yeah.
and seeking treaties. He was part of the group that negotiated the end of the war treaties.
Correct, yeah.
But he gets back to Philadelphia, and they begin this process in the Constitutional Convention, and he's very much a Voltaire.
Right.
In that, I'm not sure about this full-blown democracy thing.
Even though we modernists today would say that's exactly what he is. He's all about democracy, and that's why we revere him. But if we're wrong.
He slow walked to a bicameral legislature. He was very much a unicameral legislature person at first, and a strong executive.
So, one of the things that's interesting is when you think about, people keep talking about the United States is a democracy. No, we are not a freaking democracy.
Never have been.
Never have been, and the day we are is the day the way the political system works dies.
That's correct.
Yes.
It would be tyranny. Just tyranny of the majority.
Tyranny of the majority. And that was one of the things that I think they explicitly why they went to the balance of power in the Constitution, especially after the failure of the
Articles of
Articles of Confederation. Thank you. They were all, in a way, very much like Voltaire, even though I still think they owe more to Locke than they do Voltaire. They very much did not trust everybody to have the vote. You had to have property to vote. That's correct. Only men could vote.
That's right.
Certainly nobody who wasn't a white, of course, other than Indians couldn't vote. The slaves, even freed black men couldn't vote.
Right.
Even if they owned property, I don't think they would have been allowed to vote.
No.
So it was definitely a slow walk through there before they got to the idea of
universal suffrage,
a somewhat universal suffrage, and dropping property qualifications and things like that.
Right.
It really did.
It ultimately,
to reach that compromise.
I think until 1935, when the American Indian was finally recognized as a citizen, that's probably the last part of universal suffrage. At that point, that's kind of when we had finally done it.
But let me. I'll pull you back to your Voltaire. Okay. Franklin is the exemplar of the middle class. His values are middle class.
Right.
Practicality.
He was a printer, actually.
Yes.
Yeah,
he was a merchant.
Right, exactly.
And America was a merchant nation at that point. Or
the North was.
Yes.
I mean, the South was always agrarian.
Correct.
Yes.
Which is something they did not foresee as well as perhaps they could have.
Yeah.
Well, they ultimately had to compromise around it.
Right.
Yeah.
But his values of practicality, doing the most good you can, are very deist. We talked a little bit last time about the philosophy of deism and all that, where it's a reaction against different types of Christian sects of, is faith alone the path to salvation, or is it good works, and it's this very much a struggle that Franklin ends up in this kind of middle ground as a deist, and then that from there he builds this very middle class, pragmatic, compromising set of values. And to me, there's your root of the revolution, more so than Voltaire.
The American Revolution.
Yes,
yeah.
The American Revolution.
Right, yeah.
Yes, we talked about France last time.
That's correct. Yeah,
Let's focus on America this time.
So you think that it's Franklin's compromise on Voltaire's principles that we ultimately ended up with?
I think it's... no, I think in Voltaire, Franklin recognized a fellow traveler.
A useful tool.
I don't even know you could say it's compromising.
I think he was there already before he really gets to Voltaire.
Voltaire simply quantifies it and brings it to an articulated point. But Franklin was already there.
Voltaire's a more prolific writer.
Correct. More polished by the time he's finished. Yes.
But I think Franklin and most of the other patriots, while again they see a kindred spirit in Voltaire, I think they're already there without being necessarily influenced by him.
That's a good question. I don't know how well they had read him or Locke or any
something
others.
I was going to bring up that I made note that I wanted to bring up last time when we talked about Voltaire. Obviously, being French, he probably wrote in French, maybe Latin. I'm not sure.
French. It's mostly French.
So, how much of that is actually going to be translated and across the sea into the 13 colonies?
Good question.
And so few of the early patriots
We're literate.
were literate in more than one language. A few knew Greek and Latin, probably.
Right. But
Jefferson, I think,
Voltaire
knew
was
Greek,
not. It was
or could
mostly
read in
French.
some
Yeah,
Greek.
I mean, not that he didn't, but you're right. But this is so new. It's kind of like putting a popular culture translating into Latin. Nobody's doing that. Nobody wants to do that.
Right.
I mean, I'm not saying the ideas didn't filter over in some way. Obviously, they did. They knew who Voltaire was. They saw him as a kindred spirit.
Right.
But again, Franklin was thrilled, absolutely thrilled to meet him.
Right.
But I think they were there. Franklin, Adams,
So, which leads to the
Jefferson,
Washington,
Washington.
they all
They
were
were
Madison,
there through other means than Voltaire.
Which brings me to kind of the ultimate point here. What Voltaire and Franklin and all these others understand, what they come up with, is a universal truth, is a universal good. They can't always articulate it the same, but ultimately they realize this is the right thing to do.
Yep.
And it should be done. It should be made to happen. And whatever we have to do, now that we have the opportunity, in the case of the American Revolution,
Yeah.
because they weren't thinking this way until the war was won. Not much.
I would be willing to, because you got to remember, most of the people we would consider founding fathers
Yeah.
did not serve in the army
That's
with
correct.
Washington.
Right.
The thinkers, most of the thinkers, stayed home.
That's right.
And they were in the Continental Congress.
Right.
I'm willing to bet a lot of this stuff was percolating during the war.
I would think it would almost have to be. Sure.
Yeah, I mean, again, there's a synthesis of it in the Declaration of Independence.
Right.
In Jefferson, it's in his hand,
Right.
but Franklin and Adams are the proofreaders and the editors.
Right.
Right. They wrote that together. Jefferson just put together the final draft.
Right.
Right.
And it's very much the final product is through the prism of Franklin's very middle class, very practical, and very deist, pragmatic values.
Which is taking Voltaire and turning it a few points in one direction.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not.
I think so.
And I
If,
think that
if
that's-
it can even be attributed to Voltaire at that point.
Well, I will say the Enlightenment. Because I think
Yes.
it's
Now,
definitely.
okay.
Yeah, and
That's
we're
I think
using
you're
Voltaire
right.
to stand for the Enlightenment. That's not quite fair because it's much more
I
than
think
that.
you're
Well,
I
yes,
think you're
and,
right
and,
there. Yes.
and the only reason I bring that up, not to correct you on it, but just because the founders themselves, they credit Locke
That's correct. Yeah,
and Hobbes and
that's
some
right.
of the others.
Yeah,
the
they're-
English guys.
and there's also
which is their tradition. Yeah,
big piece of it too. When you think about things like the Federalist Papers and Tom Paine, they are, and even to a degree Franklin, some of his writings, they use these quasi-Roman pseudonyms. So they feel like they're reaching back even beyond the Enlightenment to ancient Rome, ancient Greece, the start of some of these ideas that the Enlightenment has rekindled.
right. Because
You know, the
concept of-
Renaissance and the Enlightenment rekindle all of this.
well, yeah, because Plato's the one that comes up with the idea of democracy anyway, which is it was practiced in Rome, not really, but sort of kind of the Republic
well,
was.
it was,
It had.
Even
It was,
in Greece, it wasn't practiced exactly like a democracy.
well,
but-
Plato himself said
Probably
it was,
closer than any
says it
other
wasn't
place.
a true democracy is not possible, only in small groups.
right,
Yeah,
right.
Because ultimately, as Franklin is famous for saying, why should I trade one tyrant 3,000 miles away for 3,000 tyrants 1 mile away? And to be honest, thank God for that, because we would be living, and we might be on the road anyway, in that type of tyranny, where all you need is 51% and you can do what you will.
Yeah, I mean, it's...
And there are no protections for the 49.
Yeah, I mean, it was like P.J. O'Rourke wrote years ago, he's my absolute favorite is, you'd throw away the rights of man for the little kids on the milk cartons in a instant democracy,
Right.
Well, that's
You throw away...
absolutely.
Because
you
whatever the
because
thing
rationalism
of the moment is,
which
you throw everything off,
which
to
proves
fix that thing in
Voltaire's
the moment.
point
Yeah.
from the very beginning that
Yeah.
the masses cannot be trusted to rule themselves.
So-
only those who think.
Right.
Could
the
do so.
aristocracy of the mind.
Right.
So-
as we talked about.
I got to pause for a second here and take a sip of my bourbon. Because it's something you just said. It's a great PJ quote, but I'm just wondering how many people that are younger than us know what the hell a milk carton is with a kid's picture on
The
it.
little kids on the milk cartons, yeah,
Oh.
that is kind of a thing that
Well
goes
done,
back
sir.
away.
Well done, sir. It's become perhaps cliche if we're lucky.
Yeah,
Yeah.
paper milk cartons are not out there much anymore.
No, and I don't know how many of them still have kids' pictures on them.
Google it. You'll find out lots of good things if you don't know what we're talking about.
Yeah, I'm sorry, it just struck me. It's like, well,
Well, we
I
are
don't even do that anymore.
we are creatures of our era.
we are.
As everyone is.
As
We are.
Listeners, as we talked about there a few weeks ago, yeah, we're nerds, and we're nerds of a certain age.
Yep.
That's right.
So there may be a reference or two. You'll
Slightly above 50. That's all we need to say.
You kids may have to look up.
Oh,
some
great!
of these
Now you
references.
just killed half of our audience.
Oh, no.
Oh God, I'm not going to listen to those guys. They're too old.
They're too old.
Brilliance takes time to develop.
Yeah, well, that's an entirely
And
different
so does
show.
humility.
That's
You,
right.
you ain't got there yet.
So does senility. Come on. It's all,
true.
yeah.
Yeah, by the time you have enough humility to matter, you're too senile for it to work.
That's right.
So let's. I want to get back to the philosophy here. So, obviously, the ideals that all of the major enlightened philosophical writers talked about.
Right.
Doesn't matter if it was Hobbes or Locke or Rousseau.
Each had their
or
own
Voltaire.
piece, and they all kind of played
Right.
off each other in many ways.
So I don't think it really matters who we necessarily give credit to, other than the ones the founders specifically talked about. Obviously, that's going to be the ones foremost in their mind.
Right.
But they're all tied together. But the interesting thing is, and maybe this is just because it didn't start out trying to get it all 100% right. Maybe that's the reason why it worked. Just like I said last time in the last episode, Voltaire was great at espousing the philosophy.
Yes.
He sucked at living it.
Very much so.
You can make the same argument about the United States and its foundation. We were great at espousing all men are created equal.
Yeah.
We sucked at living it. And to a degree, we still do.
That's right.
So now,
And how much of a pass should we be given for that?
well,
Not much, actually. But
well, it depends.
yeah.
So if you look at it, I think from whether it was realistic, if it was pragmatic, or if it's just ingrained prejudices and, as we talk about for a future episode, confirmation bias,
Right.
they didn't try to give the franchise, meaning the vote, for those of you who aren't well versed, to every single
That's right.
person
We're
in
not
the
talking
country.
about a McDonald's franchise.
Yeah, we're not
for
talking
those-
about or Chick-fil-A or whoever,
Subway.
whatever your favorite franchise is. And maybe that is what allowed it to work, as horrible as that was. Because you look at other revolutions, and I've talked about this before in some of the other episodes. The American Revolution is unique in
Yes.
that it actually succeeded. Name another revolution that succeeded. Because even the French didn't succeed.
No.
Because as I said in the last episode too, there were actually, if you really want to look at it, a few revolutions inside what we call the French Revolution, because different groups attained power at various times.
Yeah. I mean, even somebody as big a patriot as Lafayette
Yeah.
had to go in exile, or he was going to lose his head.
Right.
There were
Yeah,
actually
it-
four
it-
French republics.
Right.
it-
Well,
it-
five.
Yeah, five. That's right.
But again, we talked about the Directory and the consulships and the terror and the guillotine.
Russia had two revolutions.
Yeah, and that became very much just shoot everybody that isn't a peasant.
Right. Even England.
It's
you know-
the American Revolution is the only middle class revolution.
Right. Right.
That's- yes,
It is
that
not
is very important.
the poor and oppressed rising up against those who owned them. Which is one of the things that makes it different. It really does have an intellectual underpinning. Not that others didn't, but I think the immediate cause of almost every revolution is because they just can't take it anymore.
Someone is disenfranchised and doesn't want to take it any longer.
Right.
Yeah.
And that is why, and that's one of the reasons why some philosophers question whether the American Revolution was a just war. Because really, we weren't really that oppressed compared to others who started revolutions. Now, I'm very pleased that we are the United States
Yeah.
and
That's
not
correct.
part of England. Don't get me wrong.
That's certainly not my area of expertise, just war theory, but
Perhaps another subject for another time.
Could be, yes.
it was what we needed to do. The revolution was necessary.
Even though it may not have been ideologically pure in its intentions, it did have a bit of
Name me a
self-interest.
revolution that is.
Precisely my point. Exactly.
But it is, again, it was, we feel like we should be full British citizens, but Parliament does not treat us that way.
Right.
They've turned soldiers loose on us. Now there's no going back. Again, Franklin being one of these, the driver of this idea of we can be more than 13 separate colonies. Because he is so well traveled, that begins to catch on. And again, he is one of the last of the initial patriots to come to the idea of independence.
Right.
But once he's there, he's all in.
Right.
He pushed all of his chips to the middle of the table. He really did. As did they all. As did they all.
Right. Even though they had no idea what it was going to look like afterwards. And in fact,
Right.
you're suggesting that the only reason we have the federal government we have today is because this confederation, which they tried,
Yeah.
which basically was, I don't use the word confederacy, but that's kind of what we're talking about here, states themselves, it was just too darn weak.
They were still very much not willing to join together.
Yes,
to
it was
accomplish-
probably the best expression in our short history of these United States are, not the United States
Right.
is.
Right.
Yeah.
They really saw themselves separate, coming together for mutual self-defense
Right.
Yeah.
and some economic stuff.
Right.
Right.
But
And
they,
ultimately,
they
it
all
was in
wanted to keep
it
their
was in
own
many
money.
respects.
Yes, that was
it
a big deal.
It was in many respects
Yeah.
13 nations.
In many respects, yes.
Yes.
But, to me, there are a lot of small bits of the American Revolution that determine, you talked about national character.
Right.
And again, a lot of the patriots are responsible for that national character to one degree or another.
Right.
Again, we tend to throw all of these guys under the bus these days. But Washington truly was one of the greatest men of history.
Correct.
All history.
Correct.
Okay, all of human history. If only for one episode, and you guys will know what I'm talking about. He walks into a meeting of Continental officers,
Oh, I think I know where you're going.
okay,
Yes.
who are PO'd that they
Uh-huh.
ain't been paid.
Right. This is towards the end of the war, after the war.
This is
right?
after the war.
That's what
This
it's
is
right
after the war.
Yeah, just after the war.
And the idea is some of these officers are talking about we're going to march on the Congress
Right.
and shoot every one of them some bitches
Yep.
and get our money. Or we'll start shooting them until we get our money.
Yeah.
Washington walks into the meeting,
Yeah.
gets his spectacles out,
That's right. I have grown
And-
gray in your service.
Yes.
Yes.
and they all realize, yes, they've sacrificed. He's perhaps sacrificed more than any of them.
Yes.
And he's not talking about shooting people.
That's right. Leadership.
And he-
True leadership.
Yeah, he
yes.
saves the revolution.
Right.
And
Keeps it from going down those canals that every other one eventually does.
Yes. Mhm.
He's
Yeah.
the
Again,
stopgap. He's the one that prevents this from
he
happening.
single-handedly-
With that moment. At that moment.
yeah, he prevents the guillotine.
That's right.
Metaphorically prevents the guillotine. He metaphorically prevents Bolshevism.
Which again is odd because it still was the intellectual and the moneyed class who was
Right.
going to do it. That is, in a way, that's so very American.
Yeah.
Yes.
But again, so odd. Our revolution is so unique.
It's so special
unique.
and so unique.
We can go a little long.
Yeah.
So, again, I know that doesn't tie too much to Voltaire for you, but to me, that's why, again, yes, they're contemporaries. He's important, but I think he's not that influential on the early patriots. There's so much more that they're drawing on.
It's simply an accident then that so much of what they espouse and indeed input into the Constitution, Bill of Rights specifically, is exactly what Voltaire said.
And that's all Madison right there. The Bill of
Right.
Rights especially is Madison.
Right.
And you'd have to look. Maybe Madison. Maybe he did read some Voltaire and get some. Who knows?
That's something I'd
He's
love to
one of
find
the
out
more
about.
educated, I
That's
think,
right.
if
Yeah,
I recall
yeah.
correctly. He's a very educated Virginia planter
Yeah.
and very
So-
much an ally of Jefferson.
Yeah, and maybe you could say that Voltaire espoused in his writings better than all those who came before him because he came at the end of the Enlightenment.
That's exactly right.
And-
Because he was a contemporary. My
Right.
lord, he is still alive in 1787.
No, 78. He died 78.
Excuse me, 78. Yes, that's right.
So, our revolution
he's
was not over yet.
Exactly. He's been gone hardly in no time at all. I mean,
Right.
and he is, as you say, he's been a rock star.
Yeah.
Everybody knows his stuff.
And admittedly, Madison is probably more likely, you would probably call him a second generation patriot.
Yes.
He was much younger,
Right.
And
Yes.
is a protege of Jefferson, and kind of but then comes into writing.
Much
into
like Hamilton is a protege of Washington.
Washington,
Right.
yeah, much
Very
younger.
much so, yeah, they're that second generation around 1800 was when they
Yeah, they're more of a
ascend.
1780, 1790
Yeah.
when they're coming in and becoming part of
Right.
the group, again opposed to somebody like a Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, those very first early patriots
Right.
before the Declaration.
Who were, you might say, more warriors than they were statesmen. We needed every one of them, though, of course.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Absolutely.
mean that's the great thing. It is a middle class revolution, but it's also this great pulling together of so many people
Right.
that all of their viewpoints and all of their skills and all of their abilities were all needed.
I don't know if I'd call it a middle class revolution, mainly because I don't know if you could really say the middle class was really developed as we think of it today.
There's some truth,
But it was-
it's a mercantilist revolution,
which is a progenitor of the middle class, as best you can come up with at this point, because there's no aristocracy.
Well,
Here.
in the South there is.
That's correct.
plantation-
There's
yeah.
a landed
I mean,
aristocracy,
yeah, I mean-
but it is not. But that is not handed down from generation to generation. It is something that you've built,
Well,
and
I'd
But-
say a lot of that has been handed down.
a little, but
not 40 generations like in England,
That's exactly right.
but
Yeah, it's
4 generations easily.
Yeah,
well, and there's no what's being handed down has real value.
well, there's the piece I'm trying to find to circle
It's
around.
not
There.
title;
Correct.
it's actual property
And wealth.
and wealth, and that tends to change your viewpoint when you've got to make something of that land on its own
Yeah.
without the added sliding through life of being called, Sir something, the Duke of Virginia,
Yeah.
or the Earl of Massachusetts.
Sirloin of beef.
So
Cirrhosis of the liver. Come on, we can keep going on that.
that America in a large degree is a reaction to that.
Yeah.
So
All right, well, I think we're right about at the end, aren't we?
Indeed, we are.
we did. We hacked on that for a good 30 minutes. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah, I think we could have gone a lot longer, too.
Absolutely. Next time, we're going to be taking this forward into the 20th century and try to go and talk about Woodrow Wilson and how some of these things that were put forth in our Constitution kind of got taken a bit of a left turn. So join us next time when we talk a little bit more about that.
Thanks for being with us here every week at Snakes and Otters, a pointless discussion of eternal questions. Be sure to spread the word on your social media accounts. Follow us and retweet us. We are on Instagram and on Twitter at Snakes and Otters.
Let your friends know that they can find us on Podbean, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, and on YouTube. Just search Snakes and Otters Podcast to find us, and please remember to leave us your comments and reviews. It helps people find us.
And you can always send us an email at snakesandotterspodcast@gmail.com.
I'm Martin.
I'm Robert.
And I'm Francis. Catch us next week. Same snake time, same otter channel.